You don't pull a load-bearing beam mid-span. I spent 35 years making sure other people understood that before I ever had to say it to my own son. I want you to remember that line because by the end of this story, it means something different than it does right now. My name is Walter Reyes. I'm 68 years old, and on a Tuesday morning in April, I stood in my own kitchen on Cedar Ridge Lane and watched my son slide a stack of papers across the table like he was selling me a used car. "You're not on the deed anymore, Dad," he said. He didn't even look up when he said it. I built bridges for 35 years with the Oklahoma Department of Transportation, the last 10 of them on the Arkansas River retrofit downtown. If you've driven into Tulsa on the 71st Street Bridge in the last 2 decades, you've driven over something I signed off on. I never told people that at parties. Elena used to tease me about it. She'd say, "Walter could talk about torque calculations for 4 hours and never once mention his own name is on the plaque." She wasn't wrong. I don't need people to notice me to know what I'm holding up. That's just how I was built. Elena passed 3 years ago this past January. Ovarian cancer, caught late, gone in 11 weeks from diagnosis. We'd been married 41 years. The house on Cedar Ridge Lane, the 3-bedroom brick we bought in 1994 for $68,000 and paid off in 2011, still has her reading glasses in the drawer by the bed. I haven't moved them. I'm not going to pretend that's healthy. I'm just telling you it's true. I drive a 2011 Ford F-150 dark blue. 141,000 miles on it, and it still starts on the first turn every morning. My hobby, if you can call it that, is restoring pocket watches at the kitchen table. Elena's father left me a box of them, broken ones nobody wanted, and I've spent 3 years teaching myself how to take apart something small and put it back together so it runs true again. It teaches you patience with things that are already broken. I think I needed that lesson more than I realized. My neighborhood hasn't changed much since 1994. Carol Whitfield, 2 doors down, still brings over a plate of lemon bars every Christmas. The Andersons across the street still let their sprinklers run too long onto the sidewalk. Cedar Ridge Lane is the kind of street where people know whose truck is whose, and for 30 years that felt like a comfort. I want you to hold on to that detail because later it becomes something else entirely. My son Marcus is 41. He's a real estate agent, does well enough on paper, drives a car nicer than mine. His wife Priya works in marketing for a hospital system downtown. They have a boy, Diego, 9 years old, who used to spend every other Saturday with me learning how to reset a mainspring. He hasn't been over since November. I want to be fair here because fair is how I was raised and fair is how I raised Marcus. He wasn't a bad kid. He was the kid who cried when we put down our old Beagle in 2003. But grief does strange math on people, and somewhere between his mother's funeral and this April morning, my son had started doing math on me too. It didn't happen all at once. That's the part people don't tell you about betrayal in a family. It doesn't arrive. It accumulates. It started small enough that I almost didn't notice, which I suppose was the point. In September, 8 months after Elena's funeral, Marcus stopped by on a Sunday and asked almost offhand whether I'd thought about downsizing. I told him I liked my house. He said, sure, and changed the subject to football. I didn't think about it again until October when Priya mentioned at Thanksgiving, in front of my sister-in-law, in front of everyone, that I'd seemed a little foggy lately. And did I want her to start coming to my doctor's appointments with me? I hadn't asked her to. I hadn't been foggy. I'd forgotten where I put my reading glasses once, the same week she said it, and I've wondered since whether that was coincidence or whether she was simply waiting for an opening. In December, Marcus asked if I'd consider adding him to my bank accounts, just in case for convenience, so bills don't get missed. I said I'd think about it. I never did it, and he never brought it up again directly, but I noticed the tone in his voice change after that, a little cooler, a little more clipped, like I'd failed some test I didn't know I was taking. By February, Diego stopped coming on Saturdays. Priya said his schedule got busy with travel soccer. I believed her because there was no reason not to, and because believing the smaller lie is always easier than confronting the larger one underneath it. There was one more thing that happened in February, small enough that I almost left it out of this telling. Marcus called me on a Wednesday night, and somewhere in the middle of small talk about the Thunder game, he asked, very casually, whether I still had Elena's engagement ring in the house. Just for insurance purposes, Dad. You should really get it appraised again. I told him it was in the safe deposit box at the bank, which was true. He said, "Good, good," in a tone that told me the question hadn't really been about insurance at all. I sat with that phone call for a long time after I hung up. I didn't have a name for what I was feeling yet. I just knew the shape of it was unfamiliar, and it was coming from somewhere I never expected to have to defend myself against. By early March, I noticed something else. Marcus had started referring to the house in passing not as your house, but as the house. A small shift, the kind you'd miss if you weren't listening for it. "We should really get the house appraised," he said once, standing in my driveway, admiring the gutters he'd never once helped me clean. I didn't correct him. I just filed it away, the way you file away a hairline crack in a support column. Not yet urgent, but no longer invisible either. Then, on a Sunday in March, I overheard something I wasn't supposed to hear. I'd walked out to get the mail, and Priya was on my own front lawn, talking to my neighbor Carol from 2 doors down, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry through the screen door behind her. "He won't even remember whose name is on it," she said, and laughed. The kind of laugh people use to make something ugly sound casual. I stood on my own porch, holding a stack of coupon mailers, and felt something in my chest go very quiet and very still. 35 years of reading Stress Fractures in Steel had taught me one thing above everything else. The crack that matters is never the one that's loud. It's the hairline one nobody's watching. I didn't say anything to Carol. I didn't say anything to Priya. I went back inside, sat down at my kitchen table, and started paying attention in a way I hadn't let myself do since Elena died. Which brings us to that Tuesday morning in April, 3 weeks later, when Marcus let himself in with his old house key, a key I'd never taken back. Because why would you take a key back from your own son? And sat down across from me at the table where he'd eaten 10,000 breakfasts as a boy. "You're not on the deed anymore, Dad," he said, and slid a folder toward me. Inside was a document titled Reverse Mortgage Equity Assistance Application, my name typed on it in a font I didn't recognize, a signature at the bottom that looked almost like mine but wasn't quite the shape my hand makes anymore, not since the arthritis set into my right thumb 2 winters ago. "I don't remember signing this," I said. "You don't remember a lot of things lately, Dad," Marcus said. Not cruel, almost gentle, which was somehow worse. "It's okay. That's why I'm handling it." I looked at my son's face, the same face that used to fall asleep against my shoulder in this exact kitchen, and I felt the floor of something I'd trusted my whole life quietly, silently, begin to give. "You don't even need this whole house, Dad," he said when I didn't respond fast enough for him. "It's just cleaner if it's in my name." I want you to sit with that sentence for a second because we're going to come back to it. I didn't argue with him that morning. I want to be honest about that. I'm an engineer. I don't make decisions on load I haven't tested yet. I told him I needed to think about it, which was true, and he left looking satisfied in a way that told me this wasn't the first move in his plan. It was somewhere in the middle of it. That night, I called the one person I trusted enough to tell the whole ugly shape of what I was starting to suspect. Deborah Chen had been Elena's closest friend since 1988, back when they both worked reception at the same pediatric clinic before Deborah moved into title and escrow work. She'd been an escrow officer at First Guarantee Title for 30 years, 65 years old now, sharp as a blade, and she'd sat with me in the hospital hallway the night Elena passed without either of us saying a word for 2 hours straight, because some kinds of loyalty don't need words. I called her at 9 at night. She didn't ask why I was calling so late. She just said, "Bring me whatever you've got." "Tomorrow morning, before 9, before the county office opens." I sat across from her the next morning with the folder Marcus had left, and Deborah went quiet in a way I recognized, because it was the same quiet I go into when I'm looking at a beam that's carrying more than it should. "Walter," she said finally, "this signature's forged." Not close. Forged. She turned the page toward me and pointed at the loop in the W. You cross your W's from a habit you picked up drafting blueprints by hand. Whoever signed this didn't know that. I want to pause here and tell you, this is the part where most people expect me to say I felt angry. I didn't, not yet. I felt something colder than that. I felt the specific stillness of a man realizing the ground he's been standing on has already cracked, and he simply hadn't heard it happen. Deborah didn't stop at the signature. She pulled her reading glasses down her nose and turned to the second page, the one with the property valuation. This appraisal is dated 3 weeks ago, she said. Did anyone come out to walk your property 3 weeks ago? I thought back. Nobody had. No appraiser had stood in my driveway. No one had measured the square footage of my garage or photographed the roofline the way appraisers always do. Whoever had produced this document had done it from a desk, using numbers pulled from the county assessor's site, padded just enough to make the loan amount look justified on paper. They didn't even bother to fake the site visit, Deborah said, half to herself, the way she used to talk through closing documents 30 years ago. That tells me something, Walter. That tells me whoever's running this doesn't expect anyone to check. Nobody was supposed to check, I said. I was supposed to be too foggy to check. Deborah looked up at me then, and for the first time that morning, something in her face softened out of professional focus into something closer to grief. She'd known me and Elena for 35 years. She'd been in the room, essentially, for every major chapter of my life since 1988. I'm sorry, Walter, she said. I know what this is costing you, and it isn't the house. I didn't trust myself to answer that. There's more, Deborah said, and this is where the story stopped being only about me. If you've been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it and drop your thoughts in the comments. Deborah pulled a thread that morning that I couldn't have pulled alone, because she had access to something I didn't: county filing records, and 20 years of knowing exactly which processing companies did legitimate work and which ones existed to skim. The reverse mortgage application had come through an outfit called Heritage Homeowner Solutions, a name designed to sound like a government program and mean nothing at all. Deborah recognized the filing agent code before I even understood what a filing agent code was. I've seen this exact submission pattern before, she said. 6 months ago, a woman named Ruth Callahan, over on Terrace Drive, 79 years old. Her son referred her to the same company. Her son, it turned out, was a real estate agent. Marcus had sold Ruth Callahan's late husband's boat in 2023, a 16-foot bass boat he'd listed for her after her husband passed. The kind of small kindness that had made her trust him completely when he'd mentioned, almost in passing at the closing table, that he knew a really good program for seniors looking to free up some equity. Deborah found the boat listing in her records within 20 minutes. It was still up on the county assessor's cross-reference, Marcus's name attached as the listing agent, dated 4 months before Ruth's reverse mortgage application went through. That's how he built the list, Deborah said, half to herself, tapping the listing on her screen. Every one of these people already trusted him for something small: a boat, an estate sale, a house he'd sold for their late spouse. He wasn't cold calling strangers, Walter. He was working people who'd already let their guard down for a reason that had nothing to do with money. I thought about how many small kindnesses I'd watched my son perform over the years, genuine ones, the kind that made people trust him, and how apparently, somewhere along the way, he'd learned to treat that trust as a resource instead of a responsibility. Deborah made 2 more calls that afternoon, one to a title colleague in Broken Arrow and one to a county recorder she'd known for 15 years. And by 4 o'clock, she had a list in front of her. Not a big dramatic stack, just a single legal pad, names written in her neat, careful hand. Ruth Callahan, 79, Terrace Drive. Then came Harold Whitfield, 72, over on Sheridan, a retired mail carrier who'd sold his late wife's craft supplies to Marcus's office for an estate sale in 2024. Then Al Ferreira, 81, whose granddaughter had power of attorney and had no idea an application had ever been filed in his name at all. Then a woman named Doris Pruitt, 84, in memory care at a facility off 91st Street, whose daughter, Deborah, later learned hadn't checked her mother's mail in months because she trusted the facility to flag anything important. By that Friday, the list had grown to 11 names, all of them elderly, all of them clients or former clients of my son's real estate business referred one by one over 18 months to Heritage Homeowner Solutions, a company that, as it turned out, paid a referral fee of $800 per closed application deposited into an LLC account that traced 3 layers down to Marcus and Priya. I sat in Deborah's office with that legal pad in my hands, and I thought about Ruth Callahan, who I'd met exactly once at a 4th of July barbecue 4 years ago, a small woman with a laugh like a bell who told me she still kept her husband's fishing rods in the garage because she couldn't bring herself to give them away. I thought about her sitting somewhere right now, maybe confused about a letter she'd gotten in the mail, maybe not even aware yet that anything had happened to her home at all. I thought about Doris Pruitt, 84, who couldn't have understood what she was signing even if someone had explained it to her slowly, twice. How does something like this run for 18 months without anyone noticing? I asked Deborah. Because nobody's looking for it, she said. Families don't audit each other. That's the whole design. You trust the person handing you the paperwork specifically because they're your son or your grandson or the nice man who sold your husband's boat. The trust is the vulnerability. It's not a flaw in the system, Walter. It is the system. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I didn't expect. My own nephew tried something similar with my sister's condo back in 2019. Nothing this organized, just pressure, guilt, the same kind of thing over and over until she almost signed something she shouldn't have. I flew out to Phoenix for a week and sat in her kitchen until it stopped. That's the only reason I recognize the shape of this so fast, Walter. I've seen the shape before. I hadn't known that about her. 35 years of friendship, and there was still a whole chapter of Deborah's life I'd never asked about because grief and busyness have a way of narrowing what we ask the people closest to us. I told her that, and she just shrugged, the kind of shrug people give when a wound has scarred over enough that it doesn't need acknowledging anymore, only understanding. That's when the anger finally arrived, not loud. I want to be clear about that, because I am not a loud man and this isn't that kind of story. It arrived the way cold arrives in November, quietly, completely, and it didn't leave. It sat with me through dinner that night, which I didn't eat. And it was still there the next morning when I called Raymond Ortiz's office and asked for the first available appointment. I hired Raymond Ortiz the following Monday. Raymond had been practicing estate and elder law in Tulsa for 22 years. A careful man with reading glasses perched on the end of his nose and a habit of tapping his pen twice before he said anything important. His office was on the 9th floor of a building downtown I'd once inspected the parking structure for back in 1998, a detail I mentioned to him mostly to fill the silence while he read. I laid the folder in front of him, along with Deborah's legal pad, and I told him everything, the forged signature, the reverse mortgage application, the 11 names, and the sentence my son had said to me at my own kitchen table. "You don't even need this whole house, Dad." Raymond read for a long time without speaking. He read the forged application twice, held the signature page up to the light at one point, and made 3 separate notes in the margin of his legal pad in handwriting so small I couldn't read it upside down. Somewhere in the second read-through, his jaw tightened just slightly, the only sign he gave that any of this had gotten under his professional composure. "I want to be straightforward with you, Walter," he said eventually. "What I'm looking at here is 2 separate problems wearing the same coat. One is a family matter, painful, but ultimately something a lot of families work through in one form or another. The other is what appears to be a pattern of elder financial exploitation using a licensed real estate business as the referral engine. Those 2 problems are going to want very different solutions, and I think you already sense that." "I do," I said. "Then I need you to tell me honestly before we go any further. which problem are we solving first? I sat with that question longer than I expected to. Then I tapped my pen twice. Then he tapped his pen twice. Walter, he said, before we talk about the fraud, and we are going to talk about the fraud, I need to ask you something. In 2004, did you and Elena set up any kind of trust? I hadn't thought about that document in years. In 2004, after a co-worker of mine went through a brutal, expensive probate fight when his father died without a will, Elena and I sat down with a lawyer, Raymond's old mentor as it happened, and put the house, along with our modest retirement accounts, into something called the Elena and Walter Reyes Family Trust. We'd done it quietly. We hadn't told Marcus, mostly because at the time he was 20 and more interested in his car stereo than his parents' estate planning, and later, honestly, because it simply never came up again. Elena kept the paperwork in a fireproof box in the hall closet. I hadn't opened that box since she died. Raymond leaned back. If that trust is still active and properly funded, and I have every reason to believe it is, then the deed to your house was never legally in your individual name to begin with, not in a way any reverse mortgage application could touch. Your son may have just tried to mortgage a house he has no legal standing to mortgage at all. I felt something in my chest that I hadn't let myself feel in 3 years. It wasn't triumph. It was closer to relief. The specific relief of an engineer discovering the load path he designed 20 years ago is still holding exactly where he put it, even after everyone forgot it was there. That night, I went home and opened the fireproof box in the hall closet for the first time since Elena died. I hadn't been able to bring myself to open it before, not out of any legal reason, just because it had been hers to organize. And going through it felt like one more small ending I wasn't ready for. Inside, beneath the deed and the trust documents and our old wills, I found a folder I didn't remember, labeled in Elena's handwriting, in case Marcus ever needs reminding what we built. But inside was a single page, dated 2004, that read simply, "We are doing this so no one, not the bank, not the county, not even our own son if he ever forgets himself, can take this out from under either of us. Love builds walls sometimes. This is one of them." I sat on the floor of the hall closet for a long time that night, holding a piece of paper my wife had written 22 years earlier, addressed, in a sense, to a version of our son neither of us had wanted to imagine, but had quietly, carefully, protected against anyway. I understood, reading it, that Elena had seen something in Marcus even then, not malice, but a softness that could be pressured, a tendency to take the easier wrong answer when the harder right one asked too much of him. She hadn't loved him any less for it. She'd simply built accordingly. But I want to be honest with you about something else, because this story isn't really about a house. 2 days later, I got a call from my niece, Carla, Marcus's cousin on Elena's side. She'd heard from Priya's sister that I was getting confused about paperwork and wanted to check in on me. I could hear the concern in her voice, and I could also hear underneath it that a story was already being told about me before I'd had a chance to tell my own. That's the part of this that still keeps me up some nights. It wasn't just the money. It was watching my son quietly rewrite who I was to the people who loved me, one conversation at a time, so that by the time the deed transferred, nobody would question it. They wouldn't be stealing a house from a father. They'd be helping a confused old man who couldn't manage his own affairs anymore. Raymond filed to formally validate and re-record the trust that same week, which meant Marcus's mortgage broker at Heritage Homeowner Solutions was going to hit a wall the moment they tried to close. But Raymond and Deborah both agreed on something important. We weren't going to tell Marcus any of this yet. "Let him finish building it," Raymond said. "A structure that's already failed is easier to prove than a structure someone tore down halfway through." I didn't love that plan. I want to be honest about that too. Some part of me wanted to call my son that night and simply ask him why. But another part of me, the part that spent 35 years learning that you never intervene on a structure until you understand exactly where every point of failure is, told me to wait. So I waited. And while I waited, Marcus and Priya moved faster than any of us expected. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday, Priya called me, the first time she'd called me directly in over a year, and told me in a bright, careful voice that Marcus had found a way to simplify things for me and that a notary was going to stop by the house Saturday morning just to finalize a little paperwork, nothing to worry about. Saturday morning. I checked my calendar. Saturday morning was also the date of a cardiology follow-up I'd had scheduled for 6 weeks, a routine stress test after some minor arrhythmia the winter before. Marcus knew about that appointment. He'd driven me to the first one. I called Raymond. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said the thing that told me exactly how deliberate this had become. They scheduled the signing for the one morning they knew you'd likely reschedule or be too tired to push back. That's not sloppy, Walter. That's planned. I want to pause here and ask you something the way I've been asking myself for weeks now. How do you sit across from your own child and understand fully, completely, that he has been planning around your absence like you were a scheduling obstacle and not his father? I didn't have an answer then. I'm not sure I have one now, but I did have Raymond and Deborah and a legal pad with 11 names on it, and a trust document that had been quietly holding weight for 22 years without anyone noticing it was there. We let Saturday come. I didn't sleep much the Friday night before. I sat at the kitchen table until nearly midnight with one of Elena's father's pocket watches, a small gold one with a cracked crystal face, taking it apart and putting it back together twice. Not because it needed the work, but because my hands needed something steady to do while the rest of me sat with what the next morning was going to require of me. At some point around 11, I found myself talking out loud to an empty kitchen, the way I still sometimes do. "You'd have handled this better than me," I told her. I don't actually believe that's true. I think Elena would have confronted Marcus the first week, loud and immediate, and I think my way, quiet, patient, structural, was its own kind of answer, just a slower one, but it felt true to say it. At 9 in the morning, I told Priya I'd rescheduled my cardiology appointment, which was true, I had, to Monday, and that I'd be home for the little paperwork. Deborah arrived at 8:45 and sat in my kitchen with a folder of her own, dressed like she was walking into a closing. Not a family confrontation, because that was exactly the posture she intended to hold. Raymond couldn't be there in person, but he was on the phone, ready, his number already dialed on the kitchen counter phone, so all Deborah had to do was hit send. "You don't have to say much this morning," Deborah told me while we waited. "Let them lay it all out. Let them believe it's working right up until it isn't. People show you who they are most clearly in the minute before they think they've won." I thought about that sentence more than once in the weeks that followed. At 9:20, Marcus and Priya arrived together, along with a notary I'd never met, not Linda Foss. The notary Deborah and Raymond had quietly flagged to the county as the one who typically worked with Heritage's paperwork. But a different woman. Younger, clearly hired for the day, carrying a stamp and a folder of documents already printed and tabbed with little yellow flags where I was meant to sign. Marcus was carrying a box of donuts, which struck me as almost unbearably strange in the moment. A box of glazed donuts from the place on 71st Street I used to take him to as a boy, set down on the same table where he'd forged my signature 6 weeks earlier. He looked genuinely pleased to see me sitting at the table. Relaxed, almost warm, in a way he hadn't been in months. The particular warmth of a man who believes the hard part is already behind him. "Deborah?" he said, a little surprised to see her there, though not alarmed. "Didn't realize you'd be joining us." "Walter asked me to sit in," Deborah said pleasantly. "Moral support." "Of course," Priya said, setting her purse down on the counter with the easy confidence of someone who has already redecorated a house in her head. "The more the merrier." "This won't take long, Dad," he said, sliding the folder toward me exactly the way he had 6 weeks earlier. "Once this is signed, I can take the reverse mortgage draw and finally get some breathing room. You'll still live here as long as you want. Nothing changes for you." "Nothing changes for me," I repeated. "Nothing," Priya said, smiling the bright, careful smile she'd used on the phone. "We just want to help you simplify things, Walter. That's all this has ever been about." The notary opened her folder and set out her stamp, her ink pad, her logbook. The small rituals of a job she probably performed a dozen times a week without a second thought. "If you'll just sign where I've flagged, Mr. Reyes, we can have you done in 10 minutes, she said, sliding a pen across the table toward me. I picked up the pen. I want to be honest with you about that moment, because it's the part of this story I've replayed the most since. For 1 second, one single second, some tired, grieving, conflict-averse part of me considered just signing it, letting the fight happen in a courtroom instead of my kitchen, sparing myself whatever came next at this table. Then I thought about Ruth Callahan's laugh like a bell and Doris Pruitt in memory care, and I set the pen back down. "Actually," I said, "before I sign anything, I want to ask you both something. Where does the money go once the draw closes?" Marcus blinked. "Into an account to cover the deficit on 21st Street. I told you that." "Which account?" "Does it matter, Dad?" "It matters to me," I said, "because Deborah found 11 other names this month who probably asked that same question and never got a straight answer." I looked at the notary. I looked at the folder. And I let the silence sit there for exactly as long as it took Marcus's smile to falter, just slightly, at the edges. The particular flicker of a man who has begun, for the first time, to wonder if the floor beneath his plan is as solid as he thought. That's when Deborah's phone rang. She answered it at the table, on speaker, which had been the plan all along. It was the county recorder's office, a colleague of hers, confirming what Raymond had filed that morning before the sun was up. An emergency validation notice on the Elena and Walter Reyes Family Trust, dated 2004, listing the Cedar Ridge Lane property as trust-held real estate, ineligible for individual mortgage or reverse mortgage encumbrance without trustee consent. There was only one trustee, me. The notary set down her pen slowly, the way people do when they realize the paperwork in front of them has become something other than routine. "I can't notarize a signature on a mortgage document for a property this individual doesn't hold clear title to," she said, looking between all of us. "This isn't his to sign away." Marcus's face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. Not anger. Not yet. Confusion first. The specific confusion of a man watching a structure he'd trusted implicitly simply fail to bear the weight he'd put on it. "That's not Dad doesn't have a trust," he said, looking at me now instead of the folder. "Mom would have told me." "Your mother and I told you a lot of things, Marcus," I said. "You weren't always listening. This was one of them." I want to tell you that I felt vindicated in that moment. Mostly, I felt tired. I looked at my son, 41 years old, sitting in the kitchen, where I taught him to ride a bike in the driveway just outside that window, and I said the sentence I'd been carrying since April. "You don't pull a load-bearing beam mid-span, Marcus. You don't know what's resting on it until it's already coming down." He didn't understand the reference. Not fully. Not yet. But Priya did. I watched it land on her face. The understanding that whatever they'd built this plan on top of had never been solid ground to begin with, and everything constructed on top of it had just come down with it. The notary, to her credit, packed up her stamp and her logbook without another word, said something quiet to Deborah on her way out about needing to speak with her own supervisor, and left the box of donuts untouched on the counter. Priya was the first to recover her voice. "This is insane," she said. "You're telling me there's some secret trust document from 20 years ago that nobody bothered to mention?" "It wasn't a secret," I said. "It was paperwork in a fireproof box that nobody asked about. There's a difference." "You could have told us," Marcus said, and there was real hurt in his voice, which I found, in the moment, almost unbearable to hear because it was aimed at me instead of at himself. "I could have," I agreed. "So could you, 6 weeks ago, instead of forging my signature." That landed the way I meant it to. Marcus sat back in his chair like something in his chest had physically given way. Priya's hand found the edge of the counter and stayed there. Deborah didn't gloat. That's not who she is, and honestly, it's not who I raised Marcus to be either, whatever he'd become in the last 3 years. She simply closed her folder and said quietly, "Walter, do you want me to walk them through what happens next? Or would you rather I just go?" Walk them through it, I said. She did. She explained in the same careful professional voice she'd use with any client that the trust filing meant the mortgage application was void, that the notary's refusal to sign meant nothing had been legally completed, and that the county had already been notified of an attempted fraudulent encumbrance on trust property. She didn't mention Ruth Callahan. She didn't mention Harold Whitfield or Al Ferreira or the other 8 names on that legal pad. That part, we both understood, wasn't going to stay inside my kitchen. Raymond, still on speakerphone, was the one who said it plainly. Marcus, I'd strongly recommend you speak to an attorney of your own before Monday, separate from whatever you and I discuss regarding your father's estate. Why Monday? Priya said, too fast. Because that's when this file leaves my office and goes to the Real Estate Licensing Board, Raymond said, along with 11 other names. The color left both their faces at the same time. Priya turned to me, and for just a moment, the bright, careful smile was gone entirely, replaced by something rawer. You'd really do that to him? Your own son? I'm not doing anything to him, I said. I'm choosing not to keep doing something for him, which is protecting a version of my son that stopped being true a long time before this morning. She didn't have an answer for that. She picked up her purse from the counter, said something to Marcus I couldn't quite hear, and walked out the front door without looking back at me. I heard her car start in the driveway a moment later, the same driveway where Marcus learned to ride a bike 34 years ago. Marcus stayed at the table. He didn't reach for the donuts. Neither did I. What happens to me now? He asked, quiet, and for the first time all morning, he sounded less like a man executing a plan and more like the boy who used to fall asleep against my shoulder in that exact chair. I don't know, I said honestly. That part isn't up to me anymore. It's up to Raymond's office and the licensing board and eventually maybe a detective. What's up to me is whether you and I have anything left to build after that. And I don't know the answer to that yet either. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's finally hearing something he's been avoiding for months. Then he stood up, left the box of donuts on my counter, and drove away in the same direction Priya had gone. I sat alone in my kitchen for a long time after that. Deborah offered to stay. I told her I needed the quiet. I'm not going to walk you through every hour of the weeks that followed, because most of it happened in rooms I wasn't in. Attorneys' offices, licensing board hearings, a quiet meeting between Raymond and a detective who specializes in elder financial exploitation. I'll tell you the shape of it in a few sentences because that's about all it deserves. The detective, a patient, methodical woman named Sergeant Alvarez, called me twice that summer, mostly to confirm details Deborah and Raymond had already documented. She told me, on the second call, that cases like this rarely start with a police report. They start, almost always, with a family member who happened to notice a hairline crack nobody else was looking for. I told her I'd spent my whole career doing exactly that kind of noticing, just never expected to have to do it inside my own family. She said that was more common than I'd think. Marcus lost his real estate license 11 weeks later, pending a broader investigation into Heritage Homeowner Solutions, whose owner, it turned out, had run a nearly identical scheme in Broken Arrow 4 years earlier under a different company name, before that case quietly stalled for lack of a single family member willing to push it as far as I had. He is, as of this recording, still working through a repayment arrangement with 2 of the 11 families, including Ruth Callahan, who got her house back with the help of Raymond's office at no cost to her at all, funded in part by a restitution order and in part, I later learned, by Marcus himself, who sold his own car to help cover the gap. I didn't ask him to do that. Raymond told me about it almost as an aside, months later. And I sat with it for a long time before I decided how I felt about it. I still haven't fully decided. I think a man can do one right thing and it doesn't erase the wrong ones, but I also think it matters that he did it without being asked and without telling me himself, like he wasn't looking for credit for it. What matters more to me than any of that legal machinery is what happened in the smaller rooms, the ones I was in. Marcus came to my house alone. 3 weeks after that Saturday, no folder this time. He'd lost weight, I noticed, the particular kind of weight men lose when they stop sleeping properly. He sat at the same kitchen table, and for a long time, he didn't say anything. I let him sit in it. I'd learned, over 35 years of engineering reviews, that silence does work words can't. I don't know how to say I'm sorry for this, he finally said. There isn't a version of sorry that covers forging your signature. No, I agreed. There isn't. I was drowning, Dad. The flip on 21st Street, I was $186,000 underwater, and I told myself I was just helping you simplify things. I told myself that so many times I think I actually believed it for a while. Did you believe it when you told Carol I wouldn't remember whose name was on the deed? I asked. I hadn't planned to say it. It had just been sitting in me since March, waiting for an opening. He flinched, visibly, like I'd struck a nerve he didn't know was still exposed. That was Priya, he said, quiet. But I didn't stop her either. I heard about it and I didn't say anything because some part of me needed it to be true. It was easier than the alternative. What's the alternative? That I was just choosing to hurt you, he said, because I didn't know how to ask for help any other way. I didn't forgive him that day. I want to be honest with you about that, because this show is called Dad's Raw Revenge, not Dad's Raw Forgiveness, and I think people deserve the truth more than they deserve a tidy ending. What I told him was this, that Diego could still come on Saturdays, because whatever his father had done, that boy hadn't done anything, and I wasn't going to let this cost him the only person left who could teach him how a broken watch gets put back together. I told Marcus that the trust stays exactly as Elena and I wrote it in 2004, and that any future changes would be made by me alone with Raymond, and no one else in the room. And I told him that forgiveness, if it ever came, was going to be earned in months and years, not in one conversation at a kitchen table, no matter how honest that conversation was. He nodded like he'd expected that answer, maybe even needed to hear it stated plainly. Before he left, he asked if he could see the trust documents, the actual paperwork his mother had signed in 2004. I hesitated, then walked him to the hall closet and opened the fireproof box myself so he could see Elena's handwriting on the original cover letter, the note she'd left clipped to the front. For whichever one of us has to figure this out alone someday, take care of him. Marcus read it twice. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded and left. Priya, I should tell you, has not been back. I heard secondhand through Carla that she and Marcus separated for a period that summer and reconciled sometime in the fall, though I don't know the details and I haven't asked. That part of his life isn't mine to narrate. Diego has most Saturdays come back to the kitchen table. The first time, 6 weeks after that morning, he was quiet in the car when Marcus dropped him off, and I wondered if he even understood what had happened between the adults in his life that spring. About 20 minutes into fixing an old wind-up alarm clock together, he asked without looking up from the tiny screwdriver in his hand, "Is Dad in trouble?" I told him the truth, in words a 9-year-old could hold on to without it breaking him, that his father had made some very serious mistakes, that there were real consequences happening because of them, and that none of it was Diego's fault, not one piece of it. He nodded slowly, the way children do when they're filing something away to think about later, and went back to the clock. Last month, for the first time since November, he asked if he could keep one of the pocket watches he'd helped me fix, a small brass one, 1940s, that used to belong to Elena's father. I gave it to him. He wears it on a chain now, even though it doesn't tell time correctly, the second hand sticking a little past the 8. I told him that was all right. Some things you keep anyway. He asked me once, while we worked on it together, why I liked fixing things that were already broken instead of just buying new ones. I told him it was because broken things still remember how to work right, somewhere inside them. They just need someone patient enough to find the part that slipped. He thought about that for a while, the way he does, turning the tiny screwdriver over in his fingers, and then he said, "Like you and Dad?" I didn't have a good answer for that one. I still don't, not fully. But I told him I hoped so, and I meant it more than I expected to. Ruth Callahan sent me a card in June. Inside, in shaky handwriting, she'd written, "Thank you for noticing what I didn't." I drove out to Terrace Drive myself, uninvited, just to see her once. And she made me sit on her porch for an hour while she told me stories about her husband's fishing rods, still in the garage, still not given away. She showed me a photo of the two of them at a lake somewhere in Missouri, decades younger, both of them laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. "He'd have liked you," she told me, out of nowhere, and I didn't quite know what to do with that, so I just thanked her and let it sit there, warm, between us. I understood that particular kind of keeping better than I would have 3 months earlier. Harold Whitfield, Al Ferreira, and Doris Pruett's daughter each received similar restitution through Raymond's office over the following months, though not without a long and difficult process that Raymond still handles for two of the remaining families as of this recording. I keep Ruth's card in the fireproof box in the hall closet, next to the trust papers, next to Elena's handwriting on the original 2004 documents. I think about that morning in April sometimes, my son sliding papers across my own kitchen table, telling me I wasn't on the deed anymore. He was wrong, of course. I was on the deed. I'd been on it the whole time, in a form he'd simply never bothered to look for because he assumed the only thing worth checking was the surface. I think, too, about Deborah's line from that Saturday morning that people show you who they are most clearly in the minute before they think they've won. I've turned that over more times than I can count since. I think it's true of Marcus and Priya, standing in my kitchen with a box of donuts, certain the hard part was behind them. But I think it was true of me, too, in a quieter way. In the minute before I thought I'd lost everything, my son, my house, the story of who my family was, I found out I'd already built something, decades earlier, strong enough to hold the weight of that exact morning. I just hadn't known I would ever need to trust it. Some evenings now, I sit at the kitchen table with one of Elena's father's pocket watches open in front of me, gears exposed, tiny and precise, and I think about how much of what protects us was assembled quietly, years before we ever needed it, by people who loved us enough to plan for days we couldn't yet imagine. Elena did that for me in 2004. I try now to do the same thing for Diego, one Saturday at a time, one small brass watch at a time, teaching a 9-year-old boy that broken things can still run true if somebody's patient enough to open them up and look. That's the thing about load-bearing structures, the ones that matter most. You don't always see them. You just trust that somebody who loved you built them carefully enough, a long time ago, to hold weight you didn't even know you'd need them to carry. Elena built that with me in 2004. 22 years later, it held. And on the mornings when I still miss her most, that's the version of her I choose to remember. Not just the woman who kept fishing rods and reading glasses and pocket watches worth saving, but the one who sat across from a lawyer in 2004 and quietly, deliberately, made sure that whatever came for our family after she was gone, it wouldn't come for the ground we were standing on. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Dad's Raw Revenge. I will see you on the next one.